Today we're going to start talking about the cardiovascular system. And we'll start our conversation with a general description of the heart, the functions of the cardiovascular system, and the main anatomical features of the heart. So cardiovascular system, its function is to transport blood that carries nutrients and oxygen towards the body tissue and take away from the tissue wastes and carbon dioxide. So, of course, respiratory system is also essential for it, but blood essentially delivers oxygen to the tissues and remove carbon dioxide from the tissues. Okay, and it also delivers nutrients to the tissues and removes wastes from the tissues. Three main components of the cardiovascular system are the heart, here, blood vessels, and the blood itself. The heart has three outer layers. It has four chambers, and it runs 2 cycles simultaneously. Heart is located in the thoracic cavity in a specific compartment that is called pericardial cavity. So pericardial cavity is covered, the walls of pericardium cavity are covered by the parietal pericardium. You can see parietal pericardium right here. The heart itself is covered by the visceral pericardium, which you can see right here. Another name for visceral pericardium is epicardium. The space between the pericardium, the parietal pericardium, and the visceral pericardium is called pericardial cavity. And this space is filled with a fluid. The function of that fluid is to provide a lubrication to the heart so it doesn't get damaged when it beats. That lubricating fluid is absolutely essential for the proper function of the heart. The wall of the heart has 3 layers. The outermost layer is called epicardium, and it is essentially the same as the visceral pericardium. Myocardium is the thick layer of muscle shown here. Okay, so this muscle layer is myocardium. And from the very, very inside, the heart is covered by the endocardium. You can see it here, the purple color, that's endocardium, which is basically a simple squamous epithelium. Sometimes these cells are also called endothelial cells that cover the inner surface of the heart. The heart has 4 chambers, 2 atria. Let me change the color of the pen. Hopefully it will be seen better. 2 atria, that's 1 and 2, and 2 ventricles, 1 and 2. The right atrium, shown here, receives the blood from the systemic circuit. The blood that goes into the right ventricle is deoxygenated. The blood vessels that deliver blood into the right atrium are superior and inferior vena cava. When right ventricle contracts, it pushes the blood into the right ventricle, shown here. Blood goes through the tricuspid or atrioventricular valve, and when the right ventricle contracts, it pushes the blood towards the lungs into the so-called pulmonary circuit. Blood goes from the right ventricle into the pulmonary trunk and then into the pulmonary arteries. When blood enters the pulmonary trunk from the right ventricle, it has to go through so-called pulmonary valve, which is one of two semi-lunar valves. Blood goes through the pulmonary circuit where it receives oxygen, and then it is returned into the left atrium, shown here, which resides over the left ventricle. Blood returns from the lungs into the left atrium, and it enters the left atrium through pulmonary veins. You can see pulmonary veins here and here. Left atrium pumps the blood into the left ventricle. Blood on its way crosses so-called mitral atrioventricular valve, you can see it here, and left ventricle pushes the blood into the systemic circuit to all the body tissues through so-called aortic valve into the aorta. So oxygenated blood can go into the so-called systemic circulation. You can clearly see that atria and ventricles are separated one from another. So atria are separated by so-called atrial septum, and ventricles are separated by the interventricular septum. I'm sorry. So here you can see the schematic location of the valves of the heart. You can see the open tricuspid valve that separates right atrium and right ventricle, open bicuspid or a mitral valve that separates left atrium and left ventricle, and two closed semilunar valves, aortic valve that separates left ventricle and aorta, and pulmonary valve that separates right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. Aorta and pulmonary trunk are collectively called the great arteries. On the picture on the right, you can see the closed atrioventricular valves, both tricuspid and mitral, and opened aortic and pulmonary valves. Now, when valves close, they produce the heart sounds, so-called lub, and dub. First, atrioventricular valves, tricuspid and mitral, close, producing the loud sound, and then closure of the semilunar valves, pulmonary and aortic, causes the second sound, the dub sound. The function of all the valves in the heart is to establish the proper blood flow through the heart, which would be veins, either vena cava or pulmonary veins, atrium, then ventricles, and then great arteries. So atrioventricular valves will be found between the atrium and the ventricles, and semilunar valves will be found between the ventricles and the great arteries. So sometimes valves, mostly pulmonary and aortic valves, can murmur, can stutter. That murmur, that sound, can be listened to by the physician using the stethoscope. Usually is the result of the poor fitting of the surfaces of the valves, so blood can slip past the valve. The heart will have to regurgitate the heart, and murmur is the sign of either dysfunctional valve or prolapsed valve. So how would we describe, let's describe again, let's put it this way, let's describe again a blood flow through the heart. So oxygen poor blood, shown here and here, enters the right atrium from the superior and inferior vena cava. Right atrium pushes the heart through the tricuspid atrioventricular valve into the right ventricle, and right ventricle pushes the deoxygenated blood through the pulmonary trunk into the pulmonary arteries towards the pulmonary circuit. In the pulmonary circuit, blood gives away carbon dioxide that we exhale and takes up oxygen from the lungs. Oxygenated blood returns back to the left atrium, which pushes that blood through the atrioventricular mitral valve into the left ventricle. Left ventricle then squeezes the blood through the aortic valve into the aorta, and oxygenated blood enters the systemic circulation. Few things that are worth highlighting. First, the function of pulmonary circuit essentially is to get rid of carbon dioxide by delivering carbon dioxide to the lungs for the exhalation, and to pick up oxygen into the blood in the lungs. The function of systemic circuit is to deliver oxygen to the tissues and to collect carbon dioxide in the tissues for the further exhalation. Another important thing to notice about the heart, you can see that the walls of the left ventricle are much thicker than the walls of the right ventricle. That can be easily explained. this picture doesn't really represent the scale, but pulmonary circuit here and here is much shorter than the systemic circuit. Since it is shorter, right ventricle doesn't have to develop significant pressure and doesn't need as strong muscle as the left ventricle does. So essentially, since left ventricle has to pump blood into the long, huge systemic circuit with a high resistance, it must have a thick muscular wall, much thicker than the right ventricle has.